Okay, so there's this question now looking at the cost of living and things along those lines. I'm just going to talk through it once again, not an expert. Other people can, I'm just trying to interpret between negotiations, or whatever. So when we look at energy costs and whatnot, and we look at the need to keep paying into and obtaining the ability for resources to keep our infrastructure going, then it just morphs and morphs and morphs. And so at some level, it seems like what we need to do is select for and incentivize minimizing the use of resources, but then that needs to be a benefit to groups. So I think this is where it kind of comes into conservative values in the sense of wanting to incentivize cutting back and having economic disciplines and whatnot. But in the system where it's like run rampant and the costs are high for everything, it doesn't benefit those people. And so I think that's some of the factors as well. And then it gets into these social programs where there does seem to be a need to help people alleviate these increase of barriers, because there's many people that would want to live off less. They would want to live closer to the earth. They would want to preserve natural resources. But a lot of times you can't, because the pace of survivability is set so high. The cost of everything is set so high, and then we have to look at what generates that. And I tend to think a huge factor is these forever wars that people are talking about. The cost of the forever wars raises the bar so high and inflates all of the things that seemingly, that people need to do in order to survive in a basic sense. They just seem to be a hemorrhage on the direction of all of our world resources and the pace by which society has to try to keep up. And so then the question is, society can't, and we're running rampant through resources and through the cost of keeping the pace of that also deteriorates in our own bodies. And the thing is that a lot of people that are seeking to vote for assistance and support are those that at times they're not the ones using all the resources. Sometimes they can't even pay their electric bills or have their basic needs met within the system. A lot of times they would just hunker down if there was some way for sustainability. And so some of the question, and I kind of said this without really crunching the numbers or anything, but there's something to it to think about. And I was saying something to the effect of if there was some type of resource reduction rewards given to people or families to incentivize using less resources, then that would in some ways be less than funding these forever wars. The argument there, and there's numbers that need to be crunched, but what I'm looking at is if people knew some basic populations of people, it wouldn't take as much for them, if they were incentivized to live off less, then they could make their lives smaller in that sense, have smaller living costs and whatnot. And in some ways shift to eventually being able to live off of, like, back in the day, like 1,000. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I was reading this book where it was saying back in the day a family could start off, making a sustainable month-to-month living from like $1,500, which seems crazy, but there's people that do. But it's not even it's hard to fathom at this point because everything costs so much now. And I'm not saying that we have to go that route, but I'm just saying there's ways that people can live along those, certain measures and whatnot. There's other factors to think about. This kind of gets into what people were talking about as pertaining to universal basic income. And it's not so much that there's a lot of numbers to crunch in terms of universal basic income. But what's interesting about it, though, is that we seem to be shifting globally into what's the next vision for sustainability and meeting the needs across the whole grid for, accounting for these now new calculations of, in the modern world, for where resources need to go where at what time, and what that looks like for the distribution of the represented needs of populations and groups, and also education and transfers of knowledge. So what does that look like? It could look different than how we've distributed it. It could look a lot different. So just looking at, just speaking into, what it could look like and whatnot. I don't, right now, I'm not seriously sitting down and crunching the numbers, but when I did get into the UBI conversation and people have their different opinions, what I was wondering in terms of crunching the numbers and looking at calculations was, because I tend to think at some level, and maybe I'm wrong, but my general tendency is that things need to be selected for what incentivizes simplifying your life and not maximizing further needs. And so what seems to coincide with, and we could look at evolutionary theory type people that study natural selection and outcomes of dispersion. There's a whole science to, and I'm not as privy to that, but that's kind of what I'm making reference to is there's certain effects that when you select for certain things, there's other outcomes, and it's hard to gauge or know what those offset of those other outcomes will be. And so what it kind of seems like at some level is if we're trying to select for or solve for a more simplified life that actually is a more enriched life as pertaining to the personal needs in our physical, the image that we're created in, our human needs, and then in relation to an environment that reflects that ability, then it seems that if there's somehow an incentive to simplify our lives onto those types of standards, the result then could potentially be that. So one of the issues that people have, say, with excessive welfare in terms of a system that keeps people farther from those types of connections, it makes them dependent on a system that keeps them further isolated in a growing setting, more urbanized setting, where you become more and more dependent on that type of grid or setting. It kind of depends. People have, cities, this isn't trying to pit rural life against urban life, but there is this sense, though, where we are talking about that because we're talking about types of infrastructure pertaining to the earth, pertaining to modern innovation, and how do we solve for that. There are ways where people develop cities where they do make, over time, people more dependent, and then there's rising costs and all of these things. We're seeing, people come out and say, we're trying to live smaller, we're trying to live very basic and simple. We have you have testimonies of people in cities where they have whole families living in small apartments, and there's just no more ability to cut back. So they try to, incorporate a certain type of urban gardening and other things to cut back on costs. So there's that question there as well, is how do we select for the ability for people to have that sustainability without just continually growing prices and whatnot, and dependence on a system that is making these other governmental choices that affect these rising costs and these rising barriers for people. So when we're looking at that, and it's I enjoy certain aspects of, the evolving of innovation and technology and whatnot, but I don't want it to be at the cost of, I don't enjoy, there's times where it's so excessive that if I had to choose, I'd much rather have the sustainability of living off of the land with, clean water and natural resources in more of a aligned connection to my life needs. I would choose that rather than a system that's so rampant and counter to that. But if we could align it much better, then of course, then that, could be useful. It can serve as connecting the human population in ways that enrich our lives rather than are so utterly destructive. And so it is just kind of the human question as to, this is the riddle we have not solved as like human beings, because across history civilizations rise and fall and they just haven't mastered these types of questions. So that's why we're talking about how do we do that. It does seem at some level, and I'm not trying to sell this idea, I'm just trying to use it as like a way to talk about and introduce things we could think about. Something we noticed coming out of COVID, even though there was pros and cons about all of these other things, there's also atrocities and difficulties. It was a difficult time for the world. So I'm not really getting into all of those things, but something that it did seem to reveal is that the world can preserve a type of the technological advancements and modern advancements and whatnot. And then people could also still just be home for a certain amount of time. And so since people were home and they were able to keep things going, I'm not saying that this would have been successful long term, it's just something to think about. The idea was that people were thinking the pace of the modern world and the cost and chasing this affordability and all of the measures of dispersion and the way that our lives were numbered by our work hours and our pay and all of these factors and equations. The idea was that it was a rat race and a pace that people thought, we can't stop it. We just got to keep going, and then we got to keep adding. We got to inflate this, that, and the other thing. What we kind of learned from COVID was that the world shut down. And when the world shut down, the natural world regenerated in a lot of ways. And so then there were testimonies of the natural world. This isn't my argument to say just shut it all down and let the natural world regenerate. It's just an idea of, because there were just so many stories coming out where the animals were coming into the cities, the waters were cleaning up, and so it was just very interesting to think about. But then what it also caused to think about was how regenerative the earth could be and how we could slow the pace of our life down. And so then it was, okay, how do we solve for preserving the benefits and whatnot, the good that we can connect with for modern technology and innovation, but then also solve for supporting the infrastructure that allows that to some degree, like selecting for the infrastructure to be able to keep that going, but then disperse some amount of like benefit to the populations. And so a lot of times the question of disbursement is through like currency, economy, work, stuff like that. But it is just kind of thinking, what are the ways to disperse the benefit to population? So then that's when people were talking about universal basic income. And I'm not saying that is finalized in terms of, like when I first heard about that, I was like, there's no way. Like my mind was just, I didn't even want to think about it, because you look at all of the things that need to be, like dispersed. It's kind of an equation when you start going into it. It's kind of an equation of where is this funding going to come from? How do you allocate it to so many in the population? And I'm not saying that I agree with any of the equations yet, but it is just the idea of causing us to think about, okay, we have to solve for the population and the certain resources, the amount of energy that's needed to keep the infrastructure going. And, the enjoyment of connecting our worlds together within a certain type of the modern grid, for the ability of flow through regions and entities and sharing of some of the work that's required to meet our basic needs, like food and all of those things and whatnot, and the maintenance of infrastructure, et cetera, right? So it is just kind of thinking, just thinking along those lines. Something interesting, though, So in getting to this equation of what are the other outcomes that it will influence, what are other behaviors if it selects for, if there's some type of like, trying to imagine if you select for, like, what are you trying to select for? If people are incentivized to look at, possibly like a standard of not wasting the energy resources, and they're rewarded for that, what might be the outcomes? So it could be that it causes people to interact with, and I don't know, this is something to think about, but it's just, like I said, trying to imagine this like mental riddle, talking about it. It could be that it would select for people engaging in the natural world a little bit more. And they say that if you love something, if you interact with something and you love something, you'll defend it, you'll preserve it. And so there does seem to be a sense, at least what you see in some situations is where if they're, and I'm not saying that, I mean, it depends on where groups are at in terms of what they need to sustain for their government. So it's not as though I'm saying certain governments can immediately do this. A lot of times governments are a reflection of what, seemingly like what they need to do to be preserved in relation to whatever the largest government standard is setting the pace for. And so you can't just go in and sit and like have a standard of saying, well, you need to do this and that and the other thing and minimize this, that, and the other thing. And so over time, that would cause groups to not have any type of competitive value in relation to these larger systems that are actually setting the pace. And then over time, it just makes everybody susceptible to the highest dominion powers and the barrier set before everybody else. So I'm not saying that everybody could do this and whatnot. It's just thinking, like from the top down, what are some and it's just kind of theorizing or whatever. It could just simply not be anything that could equate, But what you find in some places, though, if it's, if someone were incentivized, take for instance, somebody, they have a plot of land, like an acre, or whatever, and it's in a place where they could have a cabin, and if they were incentivized to not use too many resources and their footprint, like if they're documented in, whatever, and their energy footprint is smaller, and say there's like an incentive for that, because then in relation to that, then that energy could be used by the infrastructure to use it, that then disperses certain benefits to everybody. Benefits as in like modern innovation, the modern infrastructure that we can all participate among. What I mean by that, and I guess I just have to unpack everything that I'm supposing, because people maybe are thinking we don't follow what you're talking about. I guess, so to talk through the stages of it, I wasn't even really prepared to have argument along this line. I didn't even finish having coffee yet. I just saw something and it just kind of surfaces in my mind. So the follow through of that, I guess what I mean is, say somebody lives in a cabin somewhere and they have acreage and they don't want to just totally they're not against modern innovation and whatnot, but they do like the idea of being incentivized and rewarded for certain disciplines, right? And so they cut back on, like, they still use some electricity and maybe air conditioning and just some of these other features, right? So once in a while they like to watch movies, this, that, and the other. But imagine they're incentivized to not use as much. And so they get rewarded for that. And so then the outcome of that is that they go outside and they think, oh, I'm going to chop wood, or, oh, I'm going to, I'm going to get some wood available. Or, oh, maybe I don't need the heat up as high as I think I do. Maybe, other resources, right? And so they have this this ability to kind of see that. And so the outcome, I'm thinking, maybe other people will say, no, the result will be something else, whatever. The outcome could then be that they would then connect and redirect that. Like if they're incentivized to use their time doing that, then their time will shift doing other things. It could be that it is in connection to maybe like other types of resources, gardening, or like swimming so they can cool off, maybe, things along those lines. But let's say they still want to be able to benefit from going to the grocery store and enjoying an entertaining show or lecture out in town or whatnot. And so they don't want to just destroy everything. And so at some level, the other aspect of the reward they get on not using their, as much of their access to the resource grid goes to the infrastructure to use it. So let's just say, and I don't even know like how we would actually equate this. So let's just say the infrastructure needs like 50 points of the resources, and this is really not comparable, but it's just to kind of outline some of what I'm thinking about. So let's say the infrastructure to spread it out to have these other resources like roads and the modes where electricity is being generated, or whatever. They need like 50 points of it. And let's just say humans, as it's dispersed to them, will use anywhere from 1 to like 5. And so let's say if they're rewarded to use less, then say they move it down from like 5 to 4, and then they give that 1 point goes toward the infrastructure to use it, so that it can keep dispersing this to everybody. So then over time, though, they it's lowered and lowered to the point where there's the ability to still disperse it to everyone, but everyone's not using as much to draw it out from the infrastructure being able to use it on behalf of everybody. That's kind of what I'm trying to like reason through. Something that, like we also, along those lines, that would also incentivize, it seems like, people to have a better relationship to natural resources and preserving it and whatnot. And so it wouldn't incentivize rampant, excessive, like harmful urbanization and harmful modern technology that just keeps devouring the natural resources and setting people up to be pitted against others, fighting for certain types of like funding where the bar continues to get raised, and it's just all over the place, like costs and whatnot. It's hard to know how you would actually calculate that, though. Like, say somebody is just like, I'm really going to discipline myself and I'm going to live in one of those, like, I've seen this, like, I forget what country it is. I don't know if it's China or where, but they have these like micro capsule places that people stay in. And it's literally like a certain capsule they live in, and they sleep there, and then they go to work and whatnot. And then, there's all these different modes by which people try to like share share the cost of living and whatnot. There's other types of living situations where they do like shared living, and so they disperse. They live in certain shared living, and so that's how they reduce costs. So it's hard to think like how that would be like fairly calculated and whatnot, in terms of like somebody else not getting more points for the reduction of the, say like there's a house that takes like 10 points of energy, and so they knock off like 5 points and then they get all this reward, whereas there's a house that, and so this is where calculations become tricky with society, right? And then there's a house where they had already been like limiting their resource use, and they were already at like 0.1, and so then they wouldn't really get as much delegated to them for reduction. So it's just stuff like that. We look at that in terms of a lot of other costs in society where people get more from needing more, I guess you would say, rather than those that are trying to incentivize less, and then the system doesn't always reward them for selecting for less. So that's kind of what I'm getting at, is what does that look like? Where's the benefits? There are natural benefits where it could be a healthier form of living, but just looking at systems and whatnot. It's a peculiar thing to try to calculate for the whole system of life and the life points that are delegated between, and incentivizing the ability for the shared spaces of like roads and infrastructure, preserving education, incentivizing people growing into holding their place for knowledge and education, and just a variety of all of the things. When we look at cities, when we look at the shared space by which we develop for humans and whatnot, along the lines of natural resources, etc. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I'm actually revisiting this book again, kind of looking through it, among other things. So I don't know how long, I just started it, so I can't really speak on whether I agree with this argument or not, or the assessment, but it's how cities are made. It's pretty interesting though, because it does cause you to think about the way by which cities are laid out, and the transportation methods or other factors influence other ways by which the form that you live through, your time spent, the resources that you need to like interact with through trade and whatnot. So it is interesting, and the different effects by which transportation needs, which is like the movement through interaction in the city for your life needs and whatnot. So anyway, that's just kind of what I'm thinking about. A lot of other things to think about, and so I'll just kind of consider some of these things and this whole like equation of this whole unit of life, right?